Yeah. Okay. I haven't
Doc?
done it.
Okay,
Yeah.
hi. This
No,
is
he's
oh,
still,
he's still
I
turning.
I can't even see him.
No, I can't either. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if we're on. It said we were on.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't have a format or anything. I didn't know what, um,
You would
you
be
know,
running this.
yeah. So
Well, we'll just talk.
yeah, we can still accomplish something, but he's clearly having some technical difficulties.
Yeah.
Um, but so
See, now
nationalities
I
services
do have a
center.
little thing on top that says live.
Well,
So maybe we are on.
maybe we are. Hmm. Well, let's
I'm
just
going to
talk.
treat it like we are. So,
Let's go.
hello, everybody. This is Benedicte Grima, and you're watching the Break It Down show. And with me today is.
This is Dr. Ledet, and I've been with the show in the past, but we don't have Pete with us. So here we go. Benedicte, you did.
I just lost
Oh,
you.
you just lost me.
Yeah, no, okay, you're back.
All right. I know you from some of your earlier work, not personally, but I know your scholarship, your book, Secrets from the Field, some ethnographic work you did in northern Pakistan. But you've got another book that's just come out. Talk till the minutes run out, I believe's the title of it.
Yeah,
Um,
that is the title.
yeah. So tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Okay. Well, before that, just the first book I had written was this one. It's The Performance of Emotion Among Pashtun Women.
Mhm.
So that was more or less my dissertation, and kind of sets the ground because it talks a lot about um, rites and rituals among women and behaviors, and sort of it outlays the culture, women's culture. Then Secrets from the Field, which you read, which was I always looked at it as the personal memoir side of field work. It was all the sort of things that could not be written in the official dissertation. Anthropology only allows you to go so far. So this was like my personal book. And the most recent one is, yeah, Talk Till the Minutes Run Out, which the title comes actually from the fact that it bases itself on exiles and a lot of undocumented exiles in this country, specifically coming from Pakistan. And it takes a lot of different lives and looks at the entire kind of underground culture of exiles and embodies it in the voice of one character. My goal was to write a more fiction novel instead of nonfiction, thinking that
Mhm.
it would be an easier read and more people might be able to read it and understand it, and yet it still kind of pinpoints a problem and focuses on that culture. So the character is from northern Pakistan, and the the story turns around phone conversations, whether it's with his family back home or with the exile community in his city. And I mean, that's in a nutshell what it is. And
So some
yeah,
fiction informed by your scholarship.
absolutely, and informed by well, for a long time, for a period of time, I worked as an interpreter, so I was very involved in the immigrant community, the Pashtun immigrant community, and actually, sat with people for long times and did for my job. And so for me, it was a kind of a window into this culture, and I was able to take notes for myself as well and really get to know it. And sitting in these stores, I would listen to people talking, and so the idea came to make it a telephone conversation because so much time is spent on the phone. We spend we spend uh, uh, well as Americans, we go around and we go to fast foods, we go to gas stations, we take Ubers and taxis, and a lot of times, people have earphones on and they're talking in foreign languages. And so that's this character is exactly that. He works in a 7-Eleven. He works the night shift. He always has his phone on him, and he balances between customers in the store and orchestrating his life back home in his village where he is the elder and has to take care of the family. So that the conversations go back and forth between, the exile community and him back home.
And is this set in time now, or
Well,
is this?
okay, it covers the period between 2009 and 2011, which
Yeah.
is a particularly poignant
Mhm.
time in, um, this history of Swat Valley. He's from the Swat Valley. People might have heard of Malala. All right, she was also
Yes.
from SWAT, from Lower SWAT. He is from Upper SWAT, which is a completely different country. And, it gets, as the valley narrows and the mountains come down to the river. It becomes extremely rural and mostly it's very, yeah, it's a very
Mhm.
rural area. And during in 2009, which was kind of the height of the Taliban, the Taliban made Swat Valley the center of their operations. So, they were very active there. And then Pakistan government sent in the army to chase away the Taliban. And so citizens and people there that were very agricultural, quiet
Mhm.
people, were stuck in the middle, caught between the government on one side and the Taliban on the other.
Mhm.
And then to boot, in 2010, the floods came. It was a horrible year for flooding. The valley was just devastated. Bridges were swept away, just washed out. Houses were turned inside out into the river. Um, there were lots and lots of losses. And so this guy, from his 7-Eleven is navigating through all this and managing his family, trying to save his home, um, the weddings of his sons, the death of births and death of grandchildren. All of this he does from his 7-Eleven on the phone constantly.
An elder still providing for his family financially
Oh,
through his job
absolutely.
at the 7-Eleven.
Absolutely.
Wow.
As you know, remittances
Mhm.
play an enormous part in the financial stability of many of these countries.
Yes.
And so in Pakistan, it used to be said that its biggest export was labor,
Mm.
labor to the Gulf countries, labor to wherever people could go to work. But the remittances are huge.
Mhm.
Um, and so, that's how families really survive.
Yeah. Well, we even other immigrant communities in this country, it's really
It's the same
a
thing.
similar phenomenon.
Yeah,
So you
exactly.
yeah, totally drawing from real world, these are still people's lives, although
Yep.
they may be fictional characters. Um, so since I know most of your work, which has also informed some of my work that's gone into
Oh.
military operations, um, particularly dealing with female engagement. And that's where I'm familiar with your work because in some of my training prior to deploying to Afghanistan,
Mhm.
that's where I was exposed to secrets from the field. So that's actually informed some of the way that I've approached scholarship, but it's also informed the way that I saw gender and gender relations when I worked in Afghanistan for the U.S. military. Now, didn't really get to. I didn't get to really work on any with any women in Afghanistan, clearly, like you did. But I'm wondering if you're able to uh, draw out in this work of fiction anything about gender relations that could help us maybe understand the real world of gender relations with the immigrant community, but also perhaps taking us back to northern Pakistan. And I worked in southern Afghanistan, which I think the people who live there may not necessarily see much of a difference the way we do.
Yeah, I actually, I had a chance to read the article, that you and Pete wrote together, right? About
Yes,
female
with a co-author
Yeah,
who's familiar with a little bit of fiction writing,
right,
creative nonfiction. So
right.
really going to take a look at Talk Till the Minutes Run Out, because I wasn't aware that it was a work of fiction. So this is news to me. I thought we were telling a real story, but so take it away.
Yeah, no, when I read your article and I really appreciated it. And I've come across the same frustrations as you did, and I had to learn the hard way. In 1999, I went in. You know that during the 90s, when the Russians were occupying Afghanistan, there were a lot of operations in Peshawar, which was the closest anybody could get. Afghanistan was technically closed off, but the Saudis, the French, the British, the Americans, the Swedish, I mean, everybody had training facilities where they would train medics, Afghan medics, and then send them back into Afghanistan to set up clinics. And in 1999, I had the opportunity to go along with one of these missions. My role was twofold. One, to make sure that these medics who were going back were setting up clinics for the benefit of their entire village and not just the Mujahideen. And also, the second mission, as a woman, I was charged with trying to identify doctors, formerly trained doctors who had worked in Kabul prior to the Russians and who would be willing to set up women's clinics in their villages. Well, I went directly to the women, which was one thing, and they were all very, very willing to do this. But ultimately, to get any permissions, you had to go through the men, and the men did not want anything to do with this. They wanted their women to continue doing Parda, and there was not going to be any chance of setting up women's clinics, unfortunately. But in reading your article, I was kind of reminded of that experience and thinking, yeah, in order to identify women who could be helpful, you have to go through the men. And right now, that means the Taliban. And the one thing that came to mind is are women who don't have husbands, widows and women without sons. These are probably the most willing women to engage. If you in The Secrets of the Field, you read about the woman who was a Mujahideen, who worked with the Mujahideen, but she did it because she was kind of rejected in her own family. Her own husband had gone missing. She had no sons. So she was able to go back and forth and work with the Mujahideen and put together other women operations in Kabul. But, that's the kind of women to target, is those. And the only way to get to them is through the men, through the male leaders, the elders.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my show. I think I'm able to play now.
You're in. Good. Hi, Pete.
I love that.
Have you heard? Have you heard any of that?
Yeah, I heard a lot of it, and that's why I want to jump in now, because the one of the interesting things about this paper, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this topic was, one, I was glad to say it's inappropriate for us to engage the female population of Pakistan, or Afghanistan, not just because I was a male, but as an institution, because we didn't give a damn enough to learn how to do it appropriately. The other thing is I knew it would rile up the feminist crowd and get them to realize that they're just the same part of the problem, where this is not a female empowerment problem. This is a completely different cultural problem. And we struggle with that. So oftentimes, Rich and I would have to spend the first part of our presentation or talking about the paper on understanding what empowerment was and which women were we talking about empowering, and it was like this whole alternate conversation, which was really, we couldn't cover it in the academic paper, but it is part of the problem. And this is not to put down feminists. It's just to illustrate the culture that we're trying to work from has nothing to do with the culture that we're working with.
Absolutely.
Well, feminist is a big, broad bunch.
Yeah.
No, it's funny because when I was reading your article, you talked about enabling women, and kind of rang a bell with me. I said, enabling for what? What does that mean? You know, enable them to do what? Yeah, you're talking about a culture where, you know, if a woman steps out of line, she's immediately an outcast. So
Yeah, and these are some of the same women that I'm guessing you are, like, in your current occupation, helping, I guess, maybe assimilate may not be the word,
yeah,
integrate,
enculturate.
acculturate. What would be the proper way to describe what you're currently doing? Or maybe we should transition a little bit so we know where you come from, what your experience is. What are you doing now with that experience?
Well, now I'm actually
Other than writing books
yeah.
that I need to read.
um, yeah, apart from writing, I'm working with the Afghan refugee population in Philadelphia, and which, as I mentioned to you earlier, is still in real trouble because most of them are still in hotels. The city has not been able to come up with adequate housing for these refugees. So many of them, families, kids, everybody's still holed up in center city hotels. So what I do is on the one hand, I teach ESL, and on the other, I'm kind of helping them navigate through literacy and just understanding the educational system. For one, they have children in schools, how to navigate through a report card, a teachers conference, you know, things like this, how to teach your kids when you yourself are non-literate. It's possible, it's doable. It's just a question of understanding how to do it. So um, I just lend some encouragement and try to help people navigate through the culture, to enculturate, I guess you could say. But yeah,
So what are I
Pete, we
mean,
don't hear you.
yeah.
I see you
What
talking.
culture is hard, right? And so when folks ask like, hey, how do I get better at doing, this stuff in Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever you end up going, I always recommend your book. And then I say, don't read it word for word directly. Meditate on how complex the other culture is and how little you'll ever know about it, because you can't understand that. Like, one of the things I learned along the way was, hey, they talk behind my back about me in either a positive or negative way. It never occurred to me that they have their own personal interpersonal networks where messages are passed. And like, so I have trouble sitting on the ground because I have bad hips. And so all of a sudden the word got around and they would start putting chairs out for me instead of having me sit on the floor,
Nice.
you know. And it's just these little things that it never occurred to me that they talked to each other, but of course they do, right? And so this enculturation process, it's easy to read, oh, I read Benedicte's book, I get it, women and they perform, and like, you don't get it. This is the whole thing. It's very hard to get.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there wasn't really a question there, but I guess, how long does it take to be able to? I mean, you spend decades in the field trying to understand. Decades with your notes and everything else, trying to understand this stuff. How long does it take to develop that cultural sense for a place that's so different?
A long time. I mean, especially as a woman, it was Pashto is something that you don't just speak it. It's a language, obviously, but it's not just a language. It's spoken. It's a whole system of behavior. And so, I mean, in the beginning, when I used to go, like in the late 70s was my first trip, and I could speak. I'd had a year and a half under my belt. I thought I could speak, and so I was allowed, by my obviously lack of understanding, to act inappropriately. I was driving by myself. I had driven from France. I was driving. I was talking with men. I could act very, very differently. By the time I came back for a longer period, I think 1982, this time I came back as a Fulbright scholar with a fellowship to be there for a year. And by now my language skills were good, but that meant that I had to act appropriately as well. So now there was no more interaction with men. Now I was hustled
Mhm.
directly into women. I was told to behave, to dress, how to eat, how to sit, how to everything. And so like I say, Pashto, you don't speak Pashto, you do it. You do Pashto, you act it. Um, and as long as I remained acting appropriately, everything went smoothly.
But once you knew the language, once you had an in, you also had an in to a different cultural code that you were now expected, because you were a woman, you were
Exactly.
expected to. Right?
Expected to do, and that's where I was kind of pushed into the women's world,
Mm.
whether by choice or not. It just happened that way. Like, the
Yeah.
culture, when you're doing anthropological work, the the place you're in, the people you're with end up kind of directing you and, in a sense, dictate to you what you're going to have access to and not,
Mhm. Mhm.
or not.
Yeah, I think Pete can agree with that. I think he's seen some of that too in his work.
I'm
We saw
sure.
some of
Yeah.
that in our work together.
Yeah.
A difference being we're with the U.S. military, and we're here to bring stability, and I say that in a
Yeah.
with a smirk. Um, but so you were essentially, especially at first, you're allowed some mistakes, if you will. Like,
Yeah.
oh well, she just doesn't know.
She just
Like,
doesn't know, right.
but with that language capability, that's a window into another world. But it's not just a window; it's a door into another world. You are now existing in, as your scholarship requires you to be there
Yeah.
in the first place. You can't, that's what field work is, going to the field. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so I
But
mean,
it's also being connected really, really helps, and I'm sure you guys encountered the exact same problem. You can't just go into, um, an Afghan area, a Pashtun area, without some kind of name behind you, some kind of connection. For me, it was university connections because I was affiliated with the Peshawar University. So, a very well known professor there is the person whose name I was able to bring into a village. And so, right away, everybody respects him and, help me set up a house and, get set up in the village. But it's a question of connecting, and if there isn't that connection, that backing, there's no way you're going to break ground. There's no way you're going to get through to anyone there. You'll always be suspect.
Mhm.
This is
Even
an
if,
important point.
yeah,
Let me just continue with that, Rich, because when we go as the Army, we come
Yeah.
with this
yeah,
biker gang that's armed and powered on creatine and energy drinks and nicotine, and they eat all your food when they show up. And so we have this entree, but it's an entree through force and compliance, right? I realized that when we showed up, we have these evil looks on our faces, and we don't ever humanize ourselves. You don't have that entree like you believe that you do. You have it because you're dangerous. But Rich and we learned to build trust, and not just build trust. That's so easy to say, but to build and test trust, extend for us to them low risk trust, and then extend higher risk trust, like in trusting our lives to these elders,
Hmm.
as they showed us their version that they could show, making an appointment, which is something the military never does, with an elder or a governor, and say, hey, your time's important, you have things to do, when should we meet, and then what's the safest way to do it. And when they say, I want to have my guys come pick you up, we have to measure our risk, but we
You
have
have
to
to,
receive their extension of trust back to us and have it validated. Not a safe and easy thing to do, but it was
right.
what was necessary before we got introduced to people that no one else in the area knew.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. Good.
it's hard to like whittle down a lifetime of field work and scholarship into a few moments of conversation. But one thing I like about your scholarly work that I've read is, um, with some reflection, it's really easy to see the amount of time that you have to commit to doing this kind of work, which is understanding your environment, essentially,
Right.
um,
Right.
for from our perspective, working with the military, in order to implement some sort of development initiative. You don't just go to the ground and make that happen. You
Right.
know,
Right.
so I think, like, the amount of time it took for you to even just to get to where you could go to the field, right? I think like speaks to, well, not just the amount of commitment it takes to do good scholarship, but you know, the amount of commitment it takes if you're going to do development work in a foreign country, and if you're going to do it properly. And by properly, I mean with less lethal outcomes and in the most correct culturally appropriate manner,
Mm.
I guess. So, because you went to the field and you already had an education, you went to the field to do work with an education you already had, but then you got an education once you went to the field. It seems
Well,
like.
it's an education in a different sense of the word too. I mean, in anthropology, we talk about, participant observation.
Mhm.
So I was always learning. I was constantly learning. There's a story that I still hear because I'm still in touch with people from there, and they still talk about this. There's a story in here where I was out in a farming family. I was way out in a very, very secluded area, and they went out. The girls went out every day and cut brush to make brooms and baskets with. And so I went with them, to try and learn how to do this. And I would hold the grass, a cluster of grass this way and then cut. Well, oh no, I was cutting this way at first. Well, my hand got completely torn up because I was doing it wrong. And they had to show me towards the end, and it was this way, but they still laugh about it. You know, the, I went out there and because that was what I was doing, was basically
Mhm.
just learning. I was constantly learning what's going on, seeing what's going on. You're just always learning.
Well, and that participant part of it, also,
Participant observation.
you weren't just doing your work, you were also building rapport,
Right.
which is really, that's a big focus on some of the stuff that that Pete and I have worked on is,
And making mistakes, and I'm sure
um,
you guys made a
oh,
lot of them too, and you learn from them, and you realize, "Oh, I really
mhm,
messed that one up."
yeah.
Yeah,
So how
you
are
can't
go ahead.
fear the mistake aspect of it. It's like one of the things I say in my rules of working in stability operations is if you're not making mistakes, you're making the first mistake. You
Yeah,
have to
it's true.
accept that you don't know. And the other thing is don't try to. Your broom story is so great. Don't try to out Afghan an Afghan. Don't try to
Yeah,
out Pashtun a Pashtun person. Let
right.
them show you. And it's okay to make mistakes. They're not gonna. As one Iraqi guy taught me this great lesson. I'm like, hey, I eat left-handed, and he's like, yeah, we know you're not Islamic. You're not from here. It's okay. We understand that foot thing that you guys are all worried about. We understand. It's a different thing. We're not dumb. We're different people. We get it. And once you give them credit for that,
Right.
it's another rapport building device.
It is. It is, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what are some of the I want to take us back to the book, if that your new book, if that's okay. If what are some of the like, not just the struggles that in particular Afghan women are having as they're trying to build their lives here in the West, in addition to the ones you've talked about. I mean, you talked about some family issues, navigating the system. What are some of the bigger cultural things, or even maybe nuanced cultural issues, that they may be struggling with, that maybe Westerners could give them a break, maybe work on building some rapport, but also maybe, are there anything, are there any, I guess, potentials that you see, like ways forward that we might be missing, that, hey, look, it's right in your face, focus on this. I want to, focus on the group that you're working with, the Afghans.
Yeah, well, this book has nothing to do with Afghan
Mm,
women. It has nothing to
yeah.
do with women here in this country. It's really the women are back home in the village. Um, the work I do right now is more, I mean, their concerns are with citizenship, with getting driving, driver's education, navigating the school system, understanding that they can request an interpreter if they're going to a teacher's conference or a doctor's visit, those sorts of things. And actually, teachers' conferences are a real stumbling block because, well, they were telling me this morning that they're referred to a telephone number. Well, they can't always navigate through the telephone call to get that interpreter going. So it's it's one thing after another, and they have absolutely no language skills
Mm.
to get through it. And husbands are away working, I mean, out during the day, so they're not there to help out. One of the things I teach is, okay, let's call in a sick child, so we don't have an absent and an absence from school. Little things like that, just tiny steps that are so painstaking and so difficult and challenging.
I want to use the book and continue this conversation. There's so many times I noticed that your book had a bunch of tabs, and mine has all these folded papers where these places where I was absolutely like, as much as I know about that area, there's people, almost every page there was something I'm like, I had no idea about that. One of them was, and I was shocked I never learned this, but just the lack of using first names to the point where women would forget their name.
Yeah.
That was never, ever brought up, ever. And maybe that wasn't what they do in Afghanistan, but just the fact that, like, that simple thing of using their name openly in open areas, I never even considered it because it was nothing that I was ever taught or exposed to.
Right. It's like kind of lack of respect. You don't use a person's first name. Yeah, you call them brother or father or uncle or auntie, but not.
Yeah, and here we are, like, Mohammed.
Yeah, right. Well, no, but it's tolerated from us. It is tolerated
Right.
from us. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's a simple thing like that where you're putting them in a different position, and this gets back to my whole thing of, like, how long does this take to be able to safely go into the field? There's so many examples. Rich and I use this example all the time where, like, if you're going to learn how to fire a weapon effectively or operate any weapon system, even getting a top secret clearance takes months and months to do, right?
Yeah.
Where there's all these processes. If you want to learn how to, if you want to teach a young soldier how to fire their weapon so they can hit a truck-sized target 800 yards away, there are very specific drills you can put them through, a certain physicality you have to attain. And then when it comes to talking to people, they're like, you have one guy spend an hour talking to one person, and that's it. And that's giving it too much credit for what it is. When we have to go out into these areas and we're trying to create stability, we're trying to create some cultural understanding, and we haven't giving it a cursory level of baseline education. I'm I've transitioned even to an even harder level now, where I'm like, just being a commander gives you no right. You have an authority, but it gives you no right to talk to the locals because you're screwing it up so often. We can't unscrew up your screw ups as fast as you're making them.
Yeah.
And commanders hate to hear that, but they also need to hear it so that we can get better. We just don't spend nearly enough time on the skills required to go out and interact. And it's not a language thing. Sure, we should learn languages, but we should also spend 60 hours learning how to work an interpreter, teaching an interpreter how to work with us, and then learning how to work as a team. We don't realize how powerful these people are in terms of culture and what they learn. We don't spend 2 minutes doing it, and when we do learn about it, it's all based on a lack of trust of your interpreter.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true that wanting to work with, I've worked as an interpreter, and it's you usually, as an interpreter, you get put in control of the situation. It's like, you wait, you stop. When I raise my hand, you stop, because that means I need to sound. But one of the things that you go back to in your article, and you say very clearly, is understanding the culture is ultimately what's going to lead to any kind of mission success. And I had an experience once where I was going up there with, like I said, there were these training facilities, and they were right on the border in Pakistan, and then from where they would send in these medics into Afghanistan. And the night before I was to leave on this mission I was talking about earlier, this was an American organization, and they put on a huge celebration. We had little hot air balloons, there were fireworks, they were playing music really loudly, and a lot of these medical trainers, were also ex-military. So anyway, nearby was a refugee camp, and the Americans just didn't understand the impact of their actions that night. These hundreds of little beautiful, what do you call them? The little hot air, they were lit up little
Flares?
balloons.
Flares.
No, they weren't flares. They weren't flares. They were literally like little miniature hot air balloons. We would light them, and they'd have little
Oh.
gas, and they would float out, but sometimes they would fall. And they were falling into the refugee camp. Now you're talking about people who have fled their villages, who have seen, who have been bombed by Russians, for whom this is simulating an entire scene of horror. And the next day in the Jeep, as we were driving into Afghanistan, I was hearing the aftermath of the chaos that had gone on in the camp that night. And as a result, that American facility lost a lot of credibility locally. They just really did. And so, yeah, understanding culture has a huge impact. Just knowing the impact of your actions, the consequences.
And once that credibility is lost, it's really hard to get back.
It is very
And
hard to get back.
it's also that credibility is hard to build in the first place, as we're
Right.
talking about a part of the world where, I mean, it really has to be earned. And, when you're working with the military in the capacity that Pete and I
Yeah.
were working with, there's the expectation that you can think and work like an ethnographer when you haven't been trained. Not everyone's been trained to think and work in that manner.
And you don't have time. You don't have the time to do it.
That was you got me right there, because that's where it usually gets to, especially with
Sure.
the way we did deployment cycles in
Oh
Afghanistan.
my gosh.
We didn't really have time, because there's we did a bunch of 1-year deployments. Well,
Yeah.
we didn't translate local knowledge effectively,
Right.
but some of that knowledge is a relationship. And when you are moving people out of an area, that it took,
Right.
here's an example. It took me working with Pete for about 3 months before one district governor that we worked with. It's not that he didn't pay attention to me or didn't give me the time of day. It took about 3 months before he was really interested in having a conversation with me, to the point where I felt this guy actually, he really wants to know why I'm in the room now,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we made a deliberate attempt to hand off a relationship, because, Pete wasn't going to get to stay there forever. I wasn't going to get to stay there forever, So even handing off relationships takes time.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily always primed to do that. And I don't think this is just symptomatic of the Department of Defense, the perspective from which, Pete and I are coming from. I think,
Mhm.
maybe the business community's got this a little bit better. Business and people who think with dollar signs are often have a little bit more foresight. When we're enacting foreign policy, or we're involved in development work for NGOs, I don't know, are we always considering some of the cultural aspects of what we're doing that could actually help us enact our programs more effectively,
Mm.
or engage in our development work more effectively?
Yeah. Yeah. So
That wasn't
how
really
has
a
it progressed
question. That was a rant.
Well, how has it progressed for you since Afghanistan? I mean, are you able to implement any changes within the military, or?
We'd have to have allowed access. It's funny that you asked that, because we were doing this really high-end work and being introduced around. And by the way, you'll appreciate this. We realized, this is way into my deployment life, that if you didn't have a religious elder at these big meetings, and not because we invited them, but because they were brought by the other Afghans, then
Right.
you didn't have a real meeting. We would you call it a shura, doesn't make it a shura, It's like,
Yeah.
It's part of having that being connected, right? You have to have
yeah.
a connection.
So we
Absolutely.
would bring this stuff up. We were talking about how we were using our communication systems with the governor, and so they were going to have a communication conference in Afghanistan at one of the higher levels. And then our commander is like, "Hey, you guys need to go to this. I'll make sure you get invited." And we got uninvited. And so it's like we had an easier time. This is 100% true. We had an easier time talking with the Taliban than we did the division that we worked underneath.
Yeah.
We didn't have entree there.
We were
These are our
uninvited,
people.
not by the Afghans. We were uninvited by the elements of the DoD we were working with. you know. So it
Oh,
wasn't the Afghans, you know.
right.
And in fact, much like, you know, like you were describing earlier, once they knew that you knew the language, you were not going to get off with some things, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Once they knew that Pete and I knew, and you know, other people that we worked with too, once they knew what we knew, Pete and I weren't going to get off the hook without having that religious element there in some way, shape, or form.
right.
Once they knew that we knew, you know,
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
know, so the way that we're helping now is we're doing our best through scholarship, and Pete is, you know, trying to scream into a hurricane with his show and with his work and his word. But we've got some scholarship that you know, that points to this stuff. It's out there.
yeah.
I've got tenure, so I write on what I want.
You just keep going.
So I am doing this stuff.
Yeah,
I use this stuff as source material.
yeah,
That's what we're doing right now. Now, you know, our voice is only so much, but we're part of a small group of people that are interested in moving the ball forward once
yeah,
we do deploy and once we do things.
right.
So I know Pete might want to rant on that for a little bit, since, you know, I just
But
took up
this is
a lot of
Rich is
space.
right. Yeah, we can write. I can produce shows. I can have you on, and I got to impress upon the audience how impactful Benedicte's work was. I mean, we're trying to read all these books. I'm reading Sun Tzu, and God bless Sun Tzu, great book. I mean, there's a lot of lessons to learn, and a lot of the lessons I took from Sun Tzu had nothing to do with fighting, you know.
Hmm.
And so my job is to go out and talk to people, and I'm learning. It took years to learn these lessons, but I had to sit in that space in between the Afghans and then the Americans, and I had to be trusted by the Americans. Look, Rich and I got kicked off
Mhm,
more camps by
mhm.
the Americans than we ever did by the Afghans.
Yeah,
You know, we
yeah,
also understood that making Afghans do American things was dangerous for them when we weren't around.
right.
And so one of the main questions that the commander asked us to figure out was, hey, how come they won't take our help? Well, it's because it's dangerous to grow grapes in the way that we tell them to. They
Right.
understand that we probably have a better idea, but when we're not around, they're exposed, and
Yeah.
the level of security required. So these are the stories that we tell, and when you see like the ridiculous story after story after story from all these different people that I've served with, you start to really put together a bigger picture. Like one of these things we often talk about 21-year wars, but there's also the amnesia of the earlier years. And so a unit can roll into the area. Maybe that unit in name has been there, but these people never have. They have no idea what they've done. Look, we were a bigger problem than the Taliban ever were in that area. If the moment we
Yeah.
stopped making
Yeah.
mistakes, then we would have had a different fight. But we were always the biggest problem.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly for a period, yeah.
Well, I think
I want to ask you about.
the
I
impulse
want.
to, you
Yeah.
know, improve, you know, the human condition is a noble one. But if that, you know, if the things you are doing to try to improve, in this case, the lives of Pashtun women in southern Afghanistan, if the things you're doing are actually causing more harm,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
not just to the people that you're allegedly trying to help, but also to, you know, in our case, you know, they're, you know, the U.S. military forces. That, you know, this is not everything. Not every patrol ended well,
Yeah,
you know, but
yeah,
not every patrol needed to happen.
yeah.
One of the other
Go ahead.
big lessons that we learned was, and I think you'll appreciate this, is you go out and you do something. You provide a bunch of seed to a bunch of farmers so they can plant a crop the next year. When you have to go back and see what happened, with no intention other than to check in with the people that you were talking to. We would
Mhm.
breeze into these villages with no intention or design of ever going back. And so you'd have these very short-term transactional things that we would report to ourselves as being these raving successes. Oh, everybody loved it when we came out and did whatever it was, the thing that we
Mhm.
did. But when Rich and I would go back the next day and say, what's the last thing the government did for you? And they would laugh on our faces.
Mhm.
You know, it's hard for the Americans to swallow that they were failing every time they went out because they never bothered to have the same look. Like if you shoot a rifle at a target and you don't ever go look at it, you have
Yeah,
no idea
follow
if
up.
you've been successful, right?
It's the follow-up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then
It's
I
true.
wanted to ask, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that. I remember seeing a lot of efforts that we thought we were doing great things, and it turned out it was very, very negative. I remember there's a lot of food distribution in the refugee
Oh,
camps
yeah.
during the 80s, and cheese, for instance. Well, sorry about that, guys, but Afghans don't eat cheese. Really not American cheese. So all this would just go lay to waste.
Mhm.
It was just laid to waste. Or in the case of, for instance, in the refugee camps, a lot of times it had to go through anything that was donated had to go through Pakistani officials and Pakistani military before distribution. Well, a lot of them were sitting there going, well, wait a minute, I don't have, this fuel for my own lamps. I don't have this and that and the other for my own family. I need it. I'm taking it. So it had to go through that process before it would even reach the refugee camps. And so the lack of that understanding meant for a lot of misdirected goods that never got really to their target.
Well, and I think that leaves a perception in the minds of the very people you're trying to help.
Yeah,
That leaves a perception of incompetence,
right,
which is
right,
something I've seen a few times. A
right,
failed project, something meant to spread some goodwill and establish some relationships, can actually do the exact opposite thing, and you show yourself to be incompetent.
right.
We've got a few of those stories as well. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, I'm sure. Well, we're
Um,
seeing it right now with the Afghan refugee population here in the
yeah.
U.S., where, like I said, they're still in hotels in many cases, and also they were located. I mean, our refugee policy happens to be that we want to locate refugees, newly arrived refugees, where existing communities already are in place. Well,
Mhm.
that's not in this case. It's kind of backfiring because what you have is an existing population of Afghans who have been here and struggled and suffered
Mm.
the indignity of being Muslim at a time,
Yeah. They
when it was,
paid their dues, right?
and they paid their
Yes.
dues, and
Now
all of a
you
sudden they're
have to pay
seeing this
yours.
new group come in, being
Yep.
given the red carpet
Mhm.
treatment, and being treated like kings, and so there's a little bit of resentment,
Yeah.
quite a bit of resentment, and possibly putting them in where already existing communities was not the best idea.
Mm. Well, because one thing, as a political scientist, some people define politics as a battle for scarce resources.
There you
So
go. Yeah,
you,
you're
you
vying for
almost instantly introduce, I think, an issue if you're. So, I mean, I could see from the perspective of, the bureaucracy. Hey, let's send them to be with other people that they already know.
mm,
But if we don't consider some of our other problems,
correct,
are
correct.
are there? Is it to the extent where maybe are there enough refugees that like tribal status is actually a problem, or something deeper, family? Like, are you having any problems there?
Well,
Or
the tribal issue will always be at the base of everything. I mean,
Mm,
if you were in Afghanistan during the 80s and 90s, you know very well that all these little mujahideen groups, all these political groups were actually families. It's all
yeah.
clan based. And one thing that I do hear repeatedly among refugees here is there's no sense of community among the Afghans. Because a lot of times I tell them, I said, you are your new family. People around here,
Yeah.
this is your new family. You guys need to cooperate. You need to work together. And what I
Mhm.
hear is there is no sense of community here. Well, at root, I think there will always be this issue of clans and tribes and families not willing to work together,
Mhm.
and then that's very difficult to put aside. They'd
Yeah.
rather, go through the struggle of being alone and figuring it out.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's tough, no matter how you look at it.
Oh, absolutely. Um, no, so we've got a community here trying to exist here in the West. They have some of them. don't have they don't have this family baggage, maybe we'll
Right.
say.
Yeah.
Everybody has some kind of tribal background though,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, but this is not. I don't think this is something that is this something U.S. Policymakers think about. Is this something the U.S. public thinks about? I'm going to answer my own question. No, So, we have to, I think, understand like how culture is interwoven, and history and heritage can still I guess, man, I'm stumbling over my words here, but I guess it still is something to consider. It's not just as easy as moving a person from a war-torn country and saying, "Here you go, here's a new life in the United States.
Right.
Welcome." You
Right.
know.
Right.
And it's much more difficult than, well, wait a minute, they're still in hotels. Okay,
Yeah.
let's find them a house. Let's integrate them into the community, right? Snap your fingers, make it happen. No, no. A little
No.
more complex is what I'm hearing.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. And yeah, I think a lot of what happened in the recent arrivals was yeah, let's just get them out of Afghanistan and get them over here, and that's it. And then it's up to churches and whoever is going around
Right.
to make sense of it and help them. That's where the real help comes in.
I wanted to ask, because of what Rich and I got to do, because of our
Yeah.
unique access, I wanted to ask about the AAA, the anthropologists, academics. They had a big problem with the program they were worked in because we weren't doing, we were doing ethical things, and we didn't work in a laboratory. Rich and I call it like gonzo anthropology, where we had to be part of this environment. We had to interact with it, and it doesn't forgive our bad behavior and our lack of preparedness, but we didn't work in an academic world. We worked in a dangerous combat world, and if we didn't go out and do this, gosh, we had no chance to get this right. We didn't work out, but I think their complaint wasn't a fair realization of what we were trying to do. We weren't there to sit on a rock for 6 months observing things. We had to go out and make infantry units less lethal, more tolerant, more enculturated, if at all possible. And
Right.
And that was damn hard to do because, again, a lot of our peers had no idea how to do any of this. Like, they just went out and were threat collectors, which Rich and I, we understand threat's important, but it's not our job. I'm like, as a collector, as a
Sure.
spy, as someone who's trying to
Sure.
do this, there's all this other stuff that's vital to our success, which is really what our job is to find the things that are causing us to lose. So what are your thoughts on folks in the AAA and being negative towards this kind of an approach to providing information to combat units?
Yeah, the main reproach, the primary reproach there is that you're using cultural knowledge um for ends that are I mean the help me out here, Rich. The political scientist, the scholar, the pure scholar is just for scholarship's
Yeah.
sake, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they kind of tend to resent, yeah, when that information is going to be used for ends that they would not want to be involved in.
Yeah, I think I know
That's
in
age
my
old.
discipline and some people, even some of my colleagues, still are not
Yeah,
interested in being change makers
right,
through action.
right.
It's one thing to write and be involved in scholarship and teaching, but not, that I want to be a practitioner because I want to take my knowledge and go make sure policies are working and implement policies in a certain way. But there are some people who say, no,
No,
we need
it
to do no
stops here.
harm. Yeah, don't do
Exactly.
anything, just create the knowledge.
Right.
And
I know.
we don't want to weaponize social science, right?
Yeah.
And I'm of,
There are two schools. There are two
yes,
schools, and
yes, and
they
it's
never really see eye to eye.
yeah,
Well, and here's the other
and
thing is
if
when you
Pete would
understand
go
the
back
military.
to school like I've been telling him to, he would answer his question for himself, but he won't go back to school like I tell him to.
No, but I think
Uh,
you guys really with given the restraints that you were working with, I think you really did a fabulous job. I mean, you had so many so many constraints from all over,
Well,
whether it was
and here's
time,
another
whether it
aspect
was, yeah,
of that thing with the constraints that we were working with, because we know military culture and because we were uniquely successful. When we
yeah,
do go up to the higher level and there is a chaplain and he is talking in terms of religion as a weapon system, and they're looking at how to combat
yeah,
um, anti-American sentiments, anti, and Rich and I are going, hey, chaplain, how about we look at the positive use of religion and when we can use their religion to their advantage,
right,
and stay out of the way of that and record those successes, because we're not bred to think like that. That took me years and years and years to be able to accept that. Like, I was afraid to even go near religion. We were actually sort of wrote a paper in part about this, the customary disregard for religion when we
huh,
deploy, and being able to look at this and say, yes, of course you're going to think of weapons, religion as a weapon system because it's threat based and everything's threat, threat, threat. And if you don't have Pete and Rich there to even try,
mm-hmm,
then it's impossible for the organization to ever get any better at this. Because I promise nobody else in the DoD is talking about religion as a way to create positive growth and culture,
yeah,
and being able to learn how to look, instead of being afraid of a mosque and never going in one, learn how to use look, I can go into a Jewish synagogue, I can do all kinds of things
sure,
if I
sure,
handle it properly, but we're never taught that. So without Rich and Pete doing their job, you have no ability to ever have any progress.
Well, and
oh,
in particular, that's the informal seal of approval that we don't really see it that way, you
yeah,
know. And when
yeah,
if we're gonna, as the political scientist in me goes back to state building, if we're going to engage in state building and we're going to be using the U.S. military to do it, we might want to think about doing it in the most culturally appropriate manner.
yeah,
Because I got a squad full of infantrymen or women that you are asking to engage in development activity that might be best left up to an NGO that is actually a little more prepared and has
yep,
already built up some, already has friends in the area,
yeah,
has networks, so that's, we try.
yeah, no,
We
absolutely, and
try.
I'm sure you found yourself engaging in religious discussions and being questioned, the million and one questions
Mhm.
about your own religions, where you
Oh, if you're willing to discuss an
Yeah.
Afghan male who has a beard like mine, who
mhm,
wants to talk religion, will absolutely talk religion.
oh, yeah,
It's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. In fact, when we were going through training, they said never talk about religion. I said, actually,
really?
I wrote my dissertation
Yeah.
on religion and politics. You don't want me to talk about what I
Yeah,
know?
really,
You know.
ah,
So
yeah,
no, we didn't subscribe to the mosque as solely a tool of hate
right,
Yeah. And
ideology.
technically,
And
Rich and I were at a mosque during prayer. It wasn't much of a mosque. It was a mud pad,
sure, oh, yeah,
but
no,
but
but
in this,
it was the center of stability actually in that valley,
yeah,
and
yeah.
within that whole district actually
yeah,
that was where the stability was coming from.
mm,
Yeah.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah. And we didn't have to paint it. We didn't have to fix it.
No,
We
no,
just left it the fuck alone.
no, we
Sorry
didn't
for
do
being
anything
clear.
with it. We just made friends with the guy who ran it,
Yeah.
and it turned
right,
out he was an all right guy.
And when he said, "Hey, I need to go pray," we said, "Do it." And then one
yeah,
time he's like, "Come with me," and we're like, "Okay," you know.
Yeah.
yeah,
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 thanks for asking. It took long
Yeah.
enough, but hey, you know.
We've hammered you for about an hour with a lot of just stuff in
Mm.
general. And I know we can have 100 more conversations, but I want to give you the chance to ask any questions of us before we wrap this up, because, just being able to do this has been a real blessing, but I don't want to deny you the chance to hit us with any questions.
And put
I
in
don't
a
know,
plug
well,
put
the
in a
only
plug
question
for
I
that
have is,
book.
what are you doing now? Are you gonna use any of this, like, now with Ukraine or any other part of the world, or you're still focusing on Afghanistan?
I use our work from Afghanistan and my observations. I use in my classrooms. I teach
Mm,
several intro classes right now.
mhm,
So the issue of human rights is a thread that's running through the entire course that my world politics course this semester.
yeah,
I've got them specifically using that paper that we wrote, the female engagement team
Yeah,
idea and the
yeah,
policy, we're
yeah.
looking at the gap between theory and practice. So, I walk into class and I draw a spaceship at the top of the board, and that's theory and philosophy and policy world is
Mm,
somewhere right here, and then I draw a little stick figure, myself and Pete down there at the bottom, and there's a big question mark in between.
mm,
So I'm using some of this stuff to try to help my students draw comparisons. I mean, clearly the situation in Afghanistan, although, I mean, the violence and the conflict part of it's similar, but
right,
the cultural situation is different. But that allows us now to talk about cultural differences and similarities. It's not the same as the United States Department of Defense operating in Zabul province, Afghanistan.
right.
This is a very different situation.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, so I'm using scholarship to inform, and the work that Pete and I did to inform my teaching and my scholarship.
honestly, great.
And I'm just trying to make us a little bit better at this stuff if we're going to take on these fights. Look, we've got service members in probably as many countries as there are countries,
Right.
trying to
Yeah.
make a difference,
Sure.
trying to partner. And we have these things called SBABs, which are just advisory brigades. But like one of the criteria to get into one is how fast you can run and how many push-ups you can do. Not can you sit there over a cup of chai and not bring up any damned business until someone else does.
Yeah.
The ultimate game is like, I'm not bringing up business until you do, and make the guy be, all right, Pete, listen, we've been sitting here for an hour. Can we get some work done? And then you're like, yes, we can. We don't teach that. So I'm just trying to continue to tell these stories and make these points so that hopefully, because look, Rich and I have written academic papers, and you know how good that is. I mean, hey, we got a citation this month, and it doesn't amplify in a way that makes sense. So
Right.
that's I hope to use this wherever we go, because we're going to be in Ukraine for a long time, because there's a lot of human struggle there, and we're as much as we love Ukraine, we're all putting blue and yellow flags in our social media things. I don't think people even know the colors of the Burma flag or the Myanmar flag or whichever, whatever state it's going to be this year. We don't even care, right? So if we're going to do this, if we're going to care, like everybody was desperate to care about the Syrians, but really no one gave two shits to actually do a thing about it. So you really truly don't care, not enough to take action. So if we're going to go do these things, let's act like we care, let's prepare for it, and let's spend time if we're going to have service members do it, I get it because they have the capacity and the access. Let's get them trained properly. Let's spend money putting them in other countries where they can learn how to enculturate wherever they go and focus on that skill as opposed to anything else that they're doing. So that's ultimately what I'm trying to do is wherever we go, we have the cultural capacity to sit down and slow down. Rich and I were so good at what we did because we had spent years and years developing our individual skills. And then the Army would love what we gave them and say, can you go in 2 weeks and go do it again in this other area?
Not 2 weeks. Not in 2 weeks. Like I can take 2 weeks and go like meet a couple people, but I can't go start this process,
Right.
And get you an answer in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you don't have to go far to, understand cultures from elsewhere. They're right here under our noses. And, Rich, I hope you do use this. You could use this in your class for immigration theory. It really gives you a good picture of the exile's life.
Yeah, much
Right
like
here.
you can't just go to Afghanistan and say, "Hey, let's build a state. Let's build functioning political institutions."
Yeah.
Well, actually, maybe they already had some of that. You just didn't know where to look, which is part of our work. Like the governance is local; it's right there.
Yeah.
So you're going to be hard pressed to have the United States military go there and just, here you go. Here's functioning political institutions, and oh, by the way, your next election is in 2 months.
Right.
So if we can't it's probably not going to be that easy to take a Pashtun woman and say, here you go, here's Philadelphia, you're now safe. I think their physical cost to war, clearly, but there's psychological costs as well. But hey, look, I think with this immigration issue, and think if we could just think through a little bit more. some of the nuances of our system, but also putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, being able to share stories,
Yeah.
you know, I think has a lot of
Yeah.
power. So I can't wait to
Wonderful.
check out your book.
Yay.
So
All right.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I really enjoyed it.
I
Let
got it
me
pulled up
try
on
to-
Amazon right now as a
I'm
plug
gonna
for
try to
Amazon
wrap this
too.
show up. Let me see if I can push this button. Stand by, you two.
Thank you, Benedicte.
Oh, no, not a problem.
Let's see if
Thank
I
you for
can-
having